Hello and welcome to Testable Faith. Today I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Bob DiSilvestro, and we are going to be talking about why more scientists don't accept that there might be a designer. Bob, it's good to have you here today.
Good to be back.
So I know you've done a lot of work. You got a PhD in biochemistry. You've thought about this for a long time. It seems like there's a lot of evidence pointing towards design, that there's a designer. But yet scientists don't seem to, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of scientists that engage that. One of the arguments I've heard regarding that is that there's just a lot of imperfect designs. So what do you do with that as a biochemist?
Well, a number of things. First of all, some of what I see as imperfection is not necessarily a flaw. We have to remember nature's supposed to be a balance. So if one animal, for example, was so good at foraging vegetation or so good at killing other animals, we might get a real imbalance in nature. So we really would want, if I was someone designing all of nature, we would want one species not to be so superior over another that it could completely crowd out the plants or the other animals.
Right.
So there is this idea of ecology and balance, and we do actually see that in nature, and it's been called a mystery that why is there balance in nature? People say, oh, nature tends to stay in balance, but why is that? And it seems to be that it's a mystery, and it could very well be that God, as a designer, kept it that way so that we don't completely run out of resource A or resource B. Sometimes animals do go extinct, but that even seems to serve a purpose in the grand scheme of nature. So some of what we see as flaws are really more limitations, possibly, to keep things in balance. There's also a trade-off between efficiency and longevity. So sometimes something that works really well in the short run might burn out a system. So having some longevity is a trade-off.
Well, that's an interesting point, because a lot of times people will point to the human eye as this poorly designed thing, but it does. It seems, at least with the research as I've investigated and read about it, is it's for a system that needs to work well, see well, not overheat, all that sort of stuff. It is really well put together to do that. That seems to be what you're getting at there.
Yeah, and there's some articles on that go into it in more detail than I'm going to here. But
Right.
I think the design criticisms of the eye have been very overrated, and some later work is saying, gee, how complex and great it works. Also,
and even that, it just occurs to me here that some places it's almost like where we see these things that we might say, ooh, that's inefficient. Oh, that's not a good design. I wonder if that's not a kind of a signpost of saying, hey, there's something we might want to investigate, that instead of that being a flaw, that's a place where we can look for something more that we're not aware of.
and that's true. Also, we need to look at this as Christians from a biblical viewpoint. According to the Bible worldview, we don't have perfection right now in nature. We're living under a state of sin where the world has been in rebellion against God, and that affects not just people's relationships with each other, but also nature itself.
Right.
So we would expect, in a biblical view, where in the natural world people and animals and plants get old and die, that we're not going to have systems that work forever. We are going to have death because of the current state we are in until Jesus returns or we go to heaven. So we wouldn't expect everything to be working perfectly. We would expect to see evidence of design, but we would also see imperfection because we are in this state of imperfection due to sin being in the world.
No, that's an interesting point. So where we see things that look weird, one, that could be a sign of, might we be missing something? And there's even a deeper question in there of, is this a well-designed system that has decayed or has some sort of flaw because of human sin, if you will?
Yeah, and I think that's the Christian worldview.
So, okay, obviously this question of imperfect designs plays into why more scientists don't see a designer, or at least see evidence against the naturalistic and maybe in favor of a supernaturalistic scenario. But what else goes into, in your assessment, why more scientists don't take this approach to how they view life on the earth?
Well, there's a number of things I could say about that. First of all, there are a lot of scientists that do see God in nature and do see God as a designer. And I think it's sometimes underestimated how many of us that are around. But there's also people that just take the viewpoint, science is science, religion's religion, we shouldn't try to mix them. That's just their mindset.
Right.
It's just the way they think, and they keep those compartments of their brain separate. Also, though, there's a lot of scientists that don't want to take that viewpoint and either don't allow themselves to do it, or if they do, they keep quiet because they can get ostracized in certain fields. Fortunately for me, at the university I was at, I was in somewhat of an applied science field. They just wanted to know that I get grants, that I publish, that I teach well, that I stay out of trouble. And they didn't care as much about the philosophical side of what I might have thought. But other sciences are not that fortunate.
Well, and I think that's an important point to point out is your experience is similar to mine. A lot of the ability I have to speak on Christian topics is related to how good, if I do good science, I have a place at the table. It kind of sounds like that's very much what you're saying. If you are doing what's advantageous to advancing the scientific enterprise, your Christian thoughts, if they will, have a place at the table.
If you're in the right department.
Okay, so there's even something more to this that you're saying.
Yes, because there are someone like Doug Axe, who's doing some very good work, was sort of asked to leave when he was kind of in a postdoctoral state, but wasn't a professor yet, that he kind of wore his welcome out a little bit.
Okay.
Where he was, because he was calling into question some things about the limits of natural selection to create certain complicated structures and functional molecules. So it kind of depends on where you are.
So it does sound like as Christians, we do need to have wisdom in how we approach that in the environment where we are.
Yeah. The other thing I hear a lot is, well, there's not published research on design. Well, you can't publish research if the rules say you can't publish it. And really, if you try to put design in a scientific paper that you're submitting, it's going to get tossed by pretty much just about every major journal. And there was an example just not too long ago where it was a group, I think, from China. They weren't even talking God. They were actually just talking about an inherent design in nature. But somebody thought it might be talking about God. And they mentioned design in their paper. Their paper got accepted. It was peer-reviewed. But people started complaining. They said the dirty word. They said design. Well, the journal ended up re-reviewing the paper and throwing it out. And retracting it. And they said, oh, and then nothing to do with that, which everybody believes that. They claimed it had nothing to do with the fact that it mentioned design. But they said, oh, it just wasn't reviewed very well. We found other things wrong with it. But that's a prime example where there is this catch-22. You have to give us published papers giving us evidence for design, but if you want to publish a paper that gives evidence for design, you can't publish it.
Well, okay, so I'm curious, how would you respond to this claim? So if somebody says, hey, you Christians kind of want to have your cake and eat it too. Some of your Christians want to say, ooh, science is untrustable and we can't trust it. That seems to provide evidence in favor of that. But yet we want to say, hey, Christianity has scientific support to it. So how would your statement kind of has this flavor of science is stacked, it's anti-Christian, don't we just have to deal with that?
Paper a while back on some differences in different species with apparent molecular weights of an enzyme I was studying, and people could interpret that in terms of evolution. I chose just not to discuss that part of it. I just plain reported my data and said, this is happening for this reason, and just did not interpret it in an evolution light. But other people would have done that, so I just avoided the subject pretty much, and that's what you're almost required to do. But I know, for example, Dr. Michael Behe at Lehigh tried to put something in that discussed a little bit of the idea of design being required for making certain systems that were what he was calling irreducibly complex, that if one part is missing, the whole process falls apart. Whereas evolution, at least in some models, you would have where you started with a system that worked a little bit well and then gradually got better and better and turned into what we have now. And he was saying, well, that doesn't work when you pull one part out, the whole thing falls down. And he tried publishing that in a mainline journal, and they just basically said, we don't publish this kind of research.
Right.
So it's really kind of unfair to say we need more publications on design before we'll accept it, but you're not allowed to publish anything that gives us that data.
You know, it almost sounds like what you're describing is a very good system that's run by flawed people, or that it's executed by flawed people. In some sense, if Christianity's true, this sort of scenario is almost exactly what I would expect.
Yeah, and also some of the reactions we get are just so angry. There are not a lot of scientists that want to engage in a reasonable discussion on this. In some cases, I'm not sure they're anti-Christian. Maybe it's just we were taught this is right and it's got to be right, so anyone that says it's wrong isn't a scientist. And it's not necessarily an anti-Christian bias, but just an going against what they feel like is already proven. And they get really angry when you bring anything up to the contrary.
That actually fits a lot of people I know, regardless of whether you're a scientist or not. So it's just kind of interesting description you're giving there.
Well, that's true in general.
Yeah.
I mean, I've published some things where I was publishing that something, for example, I was publishing something on, I mentioned copper, how it gets into cells, and someone else wrote a paper saying, oh, it doesn't work that way, it works this way. And immediately I got real angry. Let me pick this paper apart. Let me see why it was terrible. It's a natural reaction.
Right, yes.
But also, I think people that do have an atheist worldview are going to get really angry because evolution is the only game in town for them. There are people that are born-again Christians that try to mesh that with evolution and macroevolution. I personally don't think the Bible is compatible with the idea of macroevolution, but there are Christians that do feel that way, and I certainly wouldn't tell them, oh, you're not a Christian if you believe
exactly,
that.
Yeah.
But there are, for the atheists, though, this is the only choice. The evolution has to be right, because otherwise you would have to evoke God, and they don't want to do that. So that can also bring out a lot of emotion.
No, I really appreciate it. And this has been a good summary and just interesting discussion into. There's a lot of things that may play into why scientists respond the way they do, but I think there's a lot of good reasons to think that Christianity is a good explanation. Really do appreciate your comments. And if you've enjoyed the discussion, would encourage you to check out the description below. Again, there's a lot of good resources in there that you can go to explore and be better equipped to have these conversations with people God brings across your path.